What's up, everybody? I always got to start off with a disclaimer for the new peeps around here. And if you are new around here, I want you to just pause and ask yourself if this is possible. Is it possible that the loving, caring Father that Jesus spoke of is not the God of the Old Testament? I know that's crazy if it's the first time you've ever heard it, but let's see. The miracles of Jesus were curing the sick, healing the blind, casting out demons. And then the miracles of Yahweh was rivers of blood, frogs, lice, flies, sick cattle, boils, fiery hell, locust, darkness, and then his magnum opus, the expiration of every firstborn son of Egypt. And apparently Yahweh really wanted to show off that last trick because he hardened Pharaoh's heart so he could show everybody who's boss, had to do it. So the actions of Jesus and Yahweh are complete opposites, but we've been told our whole life they're the same entity. I was just told as a kid, things were different back then. Yeah, a lot. This is Marcion of Sinope, one of the original big league heretics from around 150 AD, and he thought that the OT God was a tyrannical, lesser deity, to be nice. He also wrote the first Bible. So how is it that the first guy to compile the books of the Bible is a heretic? Well, because the Church of Rome copyrighted and corporatized everything Jesus. And let's just say that they weren't very open to outside interpretations. Even after supposedly 1,500 years, things weren't looking too good. And you guys know that there was a Roman Inquisition as well. The Spanish one was especially brutal, so it gets a little more attention. But the Church of Rome don't play. I've got a whole playlist on this subject. We're up to 21 videos. And if this is your first time hearing all this, you might pause and take a minute to take it all in. And I'm just telling you, it all makes a lot of sense if you actually allow yourself to analyze the material here. I'm not saying anything bad about Jesus here. In my opinion, they're the ones that are saying something bad. They're telling you Yahweh and Jesus are of the same substance, is how I think they put it. So read the Old T, and every time it says Yahweh, put the name Jesus in there, and tell me how Jesus sent an angel to the Assyrians and off to 185,000 in one night. They just woke up, and as far as the eye can see, the campers were just tuckered out. Now, I'm fairly sure at this point that had Christians been able to read the OT in the early days of this, that it never would have been compiled alongside the New Testament. And still to this day, nobody actually reads the OT, except for a preacher will take one or two lines here and then make a morality tale out of it. Well, let's look at the whole tale of Joseph going down to Egypt, and you guys tell me what the morality is here. And by the way, yes, that is what ancient Egyptians and Hebes looked like. But let's start with a quick recap of his father, Jacob, who became Jacob Yeezy, who is renowned for his cunning and business acumen. When his brother Esau had been out hunting for who knows how long and comes back starving and asks Jacob for some stew, he says, "Sure, I'll feed you. You're my brother. But you got to give me your birthright." The eldest son, which is Esau, traditionally gets their father's inheritance. But since he was starving, Jacob did the brotherly thing and stole all that. Then as their father got older and was about to pass, Jacob puts on Esau's clothes and pretends to be him and then steals his father's blessing. Then, fearing for his life because he took all his brother's stuff, he flees up north to his uncle Laban's. He makes a deal with Laban to work for 7 years for him in order to marry his youngest cousin. And after the 7 years, Laban throws a big party. They don't say this, but it might have been a little wine involved. And Jacob wakes up the next morning with his oldest cousin instead of the youngest that he wanted. So now he's got to work another 7 years to get her. Then that turns into this weird thing where they're passing Jacob back and forth and then off to their maidservants. And eventually they have 12 sons that become the 12 tribes. Jacob is also taking care of Laban's flocks and does some creative breeding and eventually cons his uncle out of all his flocks. Laban's sons aren't too happy about losing their whole inheritance, and that's right when God steps in and tells Jacob he needs to return back to the land of his birth. Then God decides that Jacob is his kind of guy, so he goes and wrestles with him all night. He gets back home, and Esau forgives him for all the trouble he had caused earlier. But then there's a dispute between some of their children, and ultimately Jacob and his sons say, okay, if you guys want to squash this beef, then you have to worship our God, and you have to get circumcised. Then, while they're laying around recovering, they come in and off every man in the town and keep the women and the livestock. They consider both possessions. And that is the heartwarming tale of Jacob Yeezy, the patriarch of the 12 tribes. Now, there's a lot thrown in there about how God favors Jacob, but when I stand back and look at that whole scenario, it makes me wonder, well, what God favors Jacob? Well, the one that promises you and your offspring will rule the world. Hey, didn't somebody offer Jesus all the kingdoms of the world if he would just bend the knee? Who was that? Okay, so now we're going to talk about Joseph, the youngest of the 12 sons. And we have another fine tale of being a good, decent human, right? Sorry, but I don't think I want to hang out with anybody I've heard of in here so far. Now, Jacob Yeezy loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Because he had been born to him in his old age, he made him an ornate robe. This is known as the robe of many colors, and I'm just going to pass on that one. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not even speak a kind word. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." What, his older brothers didn't like that? They said, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And their disdain grew even greater. Then he had another dream and he told it to his brothers. Great idea again. "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well, he rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come down and bow down to you?" His brothers had gone to graze their flock near Shechem, and Jacob sends Joseph over to him. "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and the flocks and bring word back to me." When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He said, "My brothers and their flocks." And he says, "Well, they moved on. I heard them say they're going to Dothan." So he's finally catching up to him, and they see him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to off him. "Come now, let's off him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not shed any blood, just throw him in the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Ouch. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we off our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." Yeah, just gonna pass on that one too. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brother pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver, 20 pieces of silver. And the Ishmaelites took him down to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern, he saw that Joseph wasn't there. He tore his clothes and went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't here. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." Sorry, but I'm just picturing this one kid in the whole town that's running around in this flamboyant rainbow robe. Yeah, I think we know whose robe it is. But Jacob did, in fact, recognize the robe and says, "Oh no, a ferocious animal has devoured him, and I will continue to mourn until I join him in the grave." Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. The Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered, and when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that he gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Now, Joseph has some mad riz because everybody just gives him everything. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of him and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refuses, points out that no one is greater in this house than I am, and this would be a sin against God, and she keeps trying. One day, when everyone was out of the house, she caught him by the cloak, and he left it and ran. Then she decides to frame him, says I screamed, and he ran out. Look, I've got his cloak. Then Potiphar comes home, she tells him, and Joseph gets imprisoned. While Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him and showed him kindness and granted him favor, so that the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison. So now he's in charge of the whole prison. And I'll just tell you, when you realize that Yahweh is more like an evil jinn that has chosen one tribe of people to use to conquer the world as long as they just swear blind allegiance and do whatever depraved thing he wants, you can kind of see this as a doctrine of a state within a state. It's not as blatant as the Babylonian Holy Book, but it's still the same principle that these are the ordained people to rule over all of us chattel. But now Joseph is in charge of the whole prison, and the warden doesn't even pay attention because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success and yada yada. Am I being just too sacrilege here? Look at the big picture of this and then you tell me. Sometime later, the cupbearer and baker of the king offended their master, and they got thrown in the same place where Joseph was. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. Well, wait, I thought Joseph was handling everything, so why did the captain of the guard assign them to him? Isn't that a little bit like the bat boy telling the coach who to put on the mound? After a while, both the cupbearer and baker had a dream in the same night. Joseph sees both of them, asks what's wrong. They said, we both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And that's a big question that I have. Is it the work of God to interpret dreams? I mean, it's a lot like zodiac or divination. And I would think that a clever demon would be pretty good at interpreting dreams. Just saying, in the realm of all things possible. I'm going to skip through them telling him about their dreams, but one, he says you'll get your position back. The other says you'll get your head on a pole. And then everything happens like he said. Then 2 years pass, and Pharaoh has a dream standing by the Nile when 7 cows, sleek and fat, came out of the reeds, and after them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came out of the Nile. And the 7 ugly gaunt ones ate the 7 fat ones. Then he had a second dream where 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk, and after them, 7 thin and scorched were growing, and again, the thin ones ate up the fat ones. So Pharaoh sent for all of the magicians of Egypt. Who did he send for? Magicians, because that's who interprets dreams. Moses was a magician. King Solomon controlled demons, but none of the magicians could interpret his dream. Then the cupbearer tells Pharaoh about his dreams and Joseph. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph. They clean him up, shave him, and Pharaoh says, I had this dream. And Joseph demurely says, I can't tell you what it is, but God can. So they tell the whole story again, in case you missed it the first time. And then the second dream, whole story. And then Joseph tells them that they're both the same dream. The 7 healthy cows and grains are 7 years of good times. And then the withered everything are 7 years of famine that comes after. And he says the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So now we're getting to the good part. He says, now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the foods of these good years under the authority of the Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. And the authorities can keep this in reserve until the 7 years of famine come. This seriously reads like a bad Hollywood movie from the 30s. Pharaoh then asks, well, can we find a man like this? One in whom is the Spirit of God? And then the light bulb goes off and Pharaoh says, well, since God made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all of my people will submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So, hey, Joseph, who I pulled out of my prison 20 minutes ago, why don't I just make you more powerful than me, the Pharaoh? This is another prime example of why the Old Testament is together with the New Testament. Just so you know, the donation of Constantine is a forged document from supposedly the 4th century where Emperor Constantine signed over the entire kingdom to the Church of Rome. They basically had the whole world convinced that they were the ultimate authority. And then around the 1600s or so, I don't remember exactly, but a philologist looks at this document. Philologist studies the evolution of writing, and they say, no, there's no way that this was written in the 4th century. Just all of it is wrong. It's like somebody supposedly from the 1600s saying it's not rocket science. Well, rockets ain't been invented yet, bro. So that's just what Christianity has done with things, and others have done more here. But once again, Joseph is in charge of everything, as usual. So Pharaoh put his signet ring on Joseph's finger, kind of a symbol of power back in the day. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and he was last seen making films to deprave America's youth. That's another function of the tribe. And Pharaoh gives him a wife just to be safe. So then, during the 7 years of abundance, Joseph collected all the food produced and stored it in the cities. They stored up so much that they just stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. The 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. When people started feeling it out there, then they cried to the Pharaoh for food, and the Pharaoh said, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold the grain to the Egyptians. He didn't give it to the Egyptians. He sold it. He took it from them as they were growing it, and then he sold it back to them. If you want to hear Static preach a little here, this is the moral of the story. And I'll just tell you, I'm madder than hell, just like half the country. If you're watching this on down the line, this is just after the hurricane hit, and there are tens of thousands of people that need help out there, and they're turning away people that are trying to help and telling people, no, don't donate to the local churches or anything. Give it directly to us. We're the authorities. And really, if you stand back and look at the big picture here, what Joseph did was go down to Egypt and tell Pharaoh that Klamata Chang is about to happen, and I'm going to get filthy rich out of this instead of just doing something to help. So I'm going to skip about 4 chapters here of how his brothers who had sold him into slavery came along to buy grain, and he negotiated deals with them. None of them ever realized that it was him the whole time. And he had to mess with them a little bit for, selling him. And now they're back to a big happy family. Joseph went to Pharaoh and said, my father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen, which, just so you know, is some prime real estate for herders. Pharaoh asked them, what do you guys do? They say that we're shepherds. And of course, Pharaoh says, well, hey, you guys should be in charge of my flocks too. I mean, you're doing such a fine job of getting rich off of selling my people their grain back to them. And just so you guys know, the Egyptian records do tell of the Hyksos, which means the rulers of foreign lands. They actually came to power by slow infiltration, bringing in more and more people into government positions until they finally overthrew the ruling dynasty. They managed to split the kingdom in 2 and were eventually expelled, and I believe that is the whole reason for the first standing army ever in Egypt. So just to hear the secular side of things there. It sounds a lot like what they're talking about here in the Bible with taking over all of these important positions. So Joseph settled his father and brothers in Egypt, gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed, made sure they had plenty of food. There was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was so severe. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain that they were buying. That was the people's grain to begin with. And when all the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Hey, give us our food back. We already gave you all of our money to buy our grain." And I think everybody should be reading this more from the side of the Egyptians, because this is really just a handbook on corporate bureaucracy. But Joseph says, well, then just bring me all your livestock. I'll sell you food in exchange for your livestock, since all your money's gone. So now Joseph's got all their money, all their horses, all their sheep, their goats, their cattle, and their donkeys. And that held him over for the rest of the year. Then when that year was over, they came to him the following. And now Joseph is our Lord. We cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since all our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there's nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. What's your problem? Why are you letting us starve here? I know. Why don't you just buy us and our land in exchange for food, and then we'll just be in bondage to Pharaoh instead of starving, and Pharaoh's just a puppet at this point, sounds like. But I'm still not buying that Pharaoh gave his entire kingdom to a guy that he had just pulled out of his dungeon. Okay. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, of course, and reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. But he didn't manage to get the priest's land. Joseph said, "Now that I have bought you and your land today," for Pharaoh, of course, "here is seed so that you can plant it in the ground. But when the crop comes in, you got to give a fifth to the Pharaoh." So this is the whole invention of the royal fifth, what we now call taxes. So in all his generosity, he lets them keep 4/5, at least, And of course, all Egypt is rejoicing in gratitude. You've saved our lives. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. Thank you for setting up a bureaucracy and taking all of our food when times were good, and then taking everything we own when times were bad, including our freedom. So this is the moral tale, I guess, of why we have taxes today. And I got to read this weird little bit too. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's just thrown in at random spots. And this is going back again to the time when Jacob Yeezy was passing. And he called for his son Joseph and says, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt." What's up with the hand under the thigh thing? Anyway, that's another great tale of morality from the OT. I'm going to have to do the Book of Judges soon, because that really tells you what they're all about here. It's literally just generation after generation where God favors them and they grow strong enough to enslave all of their neighbors. That's the main goal. And then they sacrifice a goat on the wrong day or whatever and make God mad. And God allows them to be decimated down into small numbers again. And then a couple generations go by and they get back in favor with God and do it all over again, enslave their neighbors. But okay, what was the morality of that tale of Joseph, or what was the godliness of that tale? You guys do know that there is not one mention, I think there is one mention of the afterlife in the Torah, but I think they make one mention of Sheol, which is like Hades. There is nothing spiritual or sanctified about any of this. It is just getting earthly power through the help of whoever this God is. With God's help, you can get rich and powerful. Well, who is that in every other circumstance? Look at Hollywood today. I don't think they're doing rituals to God. But the moral of this story, I guess, is you can go into somebody else's land and tell them about Klamatachang and make sure they know how bad it's going to be and that it's their fault, too. If you'd have just done what God wanted you to, then this would have been avoided. But since you didn't, I'll save you. You got to give me all your food for safekeeping, air quotes. And then when you really need it, I'll take all your money for it. And then I'll take all your livestock for it. Then I'll take your land and you. And actually, I didn't realize I was going to get upset about making this video, but I am right now. I'm extremely frustrated about what's going on. I'm watching institutions that should be a safeguard against freak accidents not be there for anybody that needs them, and then using the freak accident as a means to get more monetary gain. I've been watching this my whole life. Back in the 90s when I was younger, it was the starving kids in Africa. Well, what they don't tell you is they were starving because of what the internationals did there. And then they pull on everybody's heartstrings and get them to donate money, and 1% goes to the actual cause, if that. Looking at you, MENA Global Initiative. I know some of you guys get it. Anyway, if you guys want to tell me what is good and godly about any of these sections of the Old Testament I've read on here so far, I'm all ears. I don't think there's anything in there that even closely relates to love thy neighbor. And all of these old documents are written on two completely different levels. There's the level for the vulgar, that's everybody that isn't on the inside, and then for the adept that knows how to read between the lines. And to me, reading between the lines, it just sounds like a handbook for creating a state within a state. And that if you know a little bit of magic, you can interpret some dreams, you'll go far in this world, kid. Anyway, that's enough out of me. Static out.